sat down and watched this documentary, it absolutely blew me away. So I was wondering if you could tell our listeners out there a little bit about how you first discovered the killing of America.
It was definitely on home video in the mid-90s, mid to late 90s, I think. I don't know exactly, but I know exactly where I was when I saw it, and it was the trailer initially that drew me into it. The trailer is just an absolute masterpiece of exploitation filmmaking in itself. So yeah, then it was just try and hit the video store and try and find a copy, and when I did, it was just like, I was an instant fan. It was just, there was nothing else like that. There wasn't a lot of information online at the time about it either. I mean, the internet, I guess, was still in its infancy as to what we know today, so I guess finding a lot of info about it wasn't forthcoming. It wasn't a lot easy to find, but years later I realized it wasn't released in America for a very long time, at least in the home video era, so it's no wonder why it was quite low profile.
Yeah, I did a fair bit of reading about that when I was doing the research for this interview. Was there ever really a reason given why it wasn't released in America?
I don't think there's ever been a clear reason. There's been allusions to the fact that maybe it hit a bit too close to home and no distributor wanted to touch it. But I mean, it did really good business elsewhere in the world. So, I'm really not sure. And I would have thought by the DVD era and the demand for that sort of material, with cultists and exploitation film fans, there would have been a market for it at some stage. So yeah, I'm really not sure.
Yeah. Do you know the story behind how the film came into being? Because I understand that it actually had Asian backing with the actual production.
That's right. It was the Japanese producers. So it worked with Leonard Schrader. So Leonard Schrader was married to Chieko, his wife, a Japanese wife, and they were already very well connected in the Japanese film industry. And he had the backers over there, and they really wanted to do this documentary about America off the success of films like Faces of Death, which had done really good business in Japan. So they wanted to show what America was like, but at the same time, and you'll see this on the Blu-ray, the Japanese version runs an extra 20 minutes because the producers in Japan wanted to put a bit more about America and show that it wasn't all a dark, scary place. Like the US cut really does drive home what a cold and brutal time it was back then. But the Japanese cut, has all this really beautiful footage of the Grand Canyon and wild horses and people enjoying themselves on the beach, purely because they did not want to offend America. That such was the attitude of the Japanese producers.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. Was that the reason they didn't want to offend America? Because I was wondering whether or not it was because they didn't want America to seem such a scary place that Japanese people didn't want to go there. But it was because they didn't want to offend America. Is that right?
I think, yeah. I guess being the Japanese sensibility of not really wanting to offend, and that really wanting to push that polite sort of, and maybe he wanted to do a bit more American business. I'm not too sure, but that's what I'm led to believe, that it was purely because, it didn't want to leave a bad taste in people's mouths about America.
Yeah. The other amazing thing about the documentary as well is that it showed footage that had never ever been shown before. Is there a story behind how Sheldon actually got that footage? Like, I know he had to rent the footage of the JFK assassination, but how did he go about getting some of the other bits of footage that had never been seen before?
They had a lot of footage donated to them. They had a lot of connections in American. They had a lot of connections in like newsrooms, and they actually took camera crews out on the street with police. Some of that footage is only existing in the documentary. Some of those live shootouts. A lot of that stuff, though, they were just like going through newspapers, and they had contacts at other TV stations and saying, give us footage of this, give us footage of that. And then they just had so much footage at the end of the day when it came to editing it. There's some really great extras that detail the editing of it on the Blu-ray as well. So they go into a bit more depth about, having to immerse themselves in so much of this sort of, numbing content and then having to walk out and live the rest of your life. It definitely took its sort of psychic toll to some degree.
Yeah, I was going to say Lee Percy, the editor, and also Sheldon suffered from it majorly. In fact, I think I read that Lee Percy was so traumatized that he was traumatized for years afterwards. Do the extras talk about that, and did they ever really bounce back as filmmakers after that?
Well, yeah, they both went on to have quite long careers in film. They're still working in the film industries over there. Sheldon now well into his late 70s. And, Lee Percy's still doing loads and loads of editing work. But, yeah, that is detailed in the extras as well.
Awesome. Now, I wanted to ask, how did the film affect you? Because I know that I still remember the day that someone at my high school brought in a copy of Faces of Death, and we put it on, and I think half the class were physically ill, and the rest of us just sat there mesmerized, wanting to see more. What was your reaction when you first watched this film? Like, did it traumatize you as well?
Well, I guess I wouldn't say it traumatized me. It definitely got me interested. I mean, I was already deep into like serial killers and the sort of true crime culture of the 90s at the time. These days it's like, I look at it as more of an artifact, but back then it was just like a checklist. So I got to know more about this thing, like James Hoskins, like where do I find more information about this guy? I didn't really look at it at that time. It's presented very, very differently than Faces of Death. I mean, on one hand, it's exploitative, but on the other hand, it's just presented as a very cold narrative. Whereas Faces of Death, it's really trying to be as sort of titillating as possible.
Yeah. Now, I have to ask, as a distributor, how did you go about getting the rights to this documentary, considering that it is a documentary from the early 80s? Like, that must have been quite a journey for you as well.
Well, it's actually quite easy to find. I mean, Matachiro, the producer, can be found. And yeah, when I found out that the restoration was being done, it was just a matter of getting in touch with my friends at Severin, and then all the pieces of the puzzle just sort of connected. So yeah, it actually wasn't as hard as it sort of sounds.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the extras, but tell us a little bit about what else people can expect to find on this release of it as well.
There's a commentary with Sheldon, the director, for the full US cut. There's an interview with Lee Percy. There's an interview, I forget the guy's name, as a Mondo film historian. But the big thing, I guess, with the Australian version is the 84-page booklet that comes along with the Blu-ray as well. So that's got, for the first time, like all the Japanese promotional booklet and press sheet material translated into English. There's liner notes by Chris D from the Flesh Eaters, legendary Los Angeles band who was there at the time when a lot of these things were sort of going down. Dean Brandom from Technicolor Yawn does a really great article on the killing of America in Australian cinemas. It's just mind-boggling to think that had a successful theatrical run here back in 1983, as well as just like as many different video covers as I could find, and ad mats and newspaper articles, reviews, every piece of ephemera that I could sort of collect together over several years, I put into this booklet.
How difficult was it to put all of that together as well? Like, that must have been, I'm imagining like people going through attics and stuff like that to find that kind of information, especially some of the older booklets and things. How difficult was that to put together for this release?
Extremely difficult. I'm not going to lie. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. It took years to assemble a lot of that stuff. I'm glad I took the time because, bits and pieces came to me throughout that period that, I wasn't really aware of. I wasn't aware that it had shown in New Zealand theatres, so it was great to get articles from New Zealand papers and ad mats from New Zealand. The images of the soundtrack appeared at the last minute. It was just, I'm glad I took the time, but, once again, it was just like a long, long process, and, I'm just glad to finally have the product in hand.
Yeah, you mentioned that it had a successful run here in cinemas when it first came out. Do you think that Australia was more prepared for this film than, say, other countries because we'd been through that Ozploitation period and things like that?
I'm not really sure. I mean, it only showed in Australia, and as far as we can tell, it only showed in Sydney and Melbourne. And it did really good business. It didn't show far and wide. And I would have thought, having had a print over here, they would have taken it out to the drive-ins, but maybe the distributors thought, this is a bit too gruesome for, country audiences. I don't know. I mean, we never had Faces of Death here. but for some reason, The Killing of America did really, really well, especially on home video. The Palace video throughout the 80s and 90s was a staple of video stores, and then there were bootlegs that floated around for a long time after that. So I'm not really sure why it just took off here. I think basically down to the marketing of the Palace Explosive home video range, I think played a huge part in its profile.
Definitely. Now, to finish off, I know a lot of our listeners out there are going to want to go out and grab a copy, especially now they know all about the extras and everything with it. Where can they go to grab a copy at the moment?
Go directly to the X-Film Big Cartel. That's Xfilm, exfilm.bigcartel.com. And it's available on there as well with a pin. There's a limited pin and also a VHS edition. There was a limited Betamax edition as well, but they sold out really fast. But there's plenty of copies of the VHS available as well. But yeah, the Blu-ray itself is available, and that comes with the booklet too.
Awesome. Well, mate, I know a lot of people out there are going to want to buy a copy. So to finish off, what would you like to say to people out there that are thinking about going in and buying a copy?
Know the truth and survive the killing of America.
Awesome. Well, mate, thank you so much for chatting to us today. It's been an absolute privilege chatting to you, and we can't wait to see what X-Film has coming out next as well.
Cheers, Dave. I've got a lot of stuff in the pipeline, so keep your eyes peeled.